Hello and welcome to Thursdays on the Stoop. I'm Julian, one of Blue Stoop's two co-directors, and we are a literary arts organization serving the greater Philadelphia area and our friends on the internet. So glad you could be here for Avoiding the Info Dump, a generative session with Tony Knighton. Tony is an American crime fiction author known for his lean, suspenseful writing style. He is a 38-year veteran of the Philadelphia Fire Department, which has influenced his writing and given him a unique perspective on the darker aspects of urban life. Tony has written a collection, Happy Hour, and Other Philadelphia Cruelties, and three novels, 3 Hours Past Midnight, A Few Days Away, and A Night at the Shore, all published by Brash Books. In addition to his books, he's had short stories published in various crime fiction anthologies and magazines, further establishing himself as a respected voice in the genre. We're so happy to have Tony here today. I'm going to share some links in the chat now and again at the end where you can keep an eye out for other upcoming events, subscribe to our newsletter, and support Blue Stoop. Of course, this is a free session. We're just glad you're here. But if you do want to chip in, bluestoop.org/donate. It's much appreciated. We've also got a very cool auction going on with all kinds of fabulous prizes, but I won't bore you about that until much later. I'm going to hand things over to Tony. Take it away.
All right. Thanks a lot, Julian, and thanks to everybody at Blue Stoop. And like Julian said, I write crime fiction, but I believe that everything I'm going to talk about today is applicable to any fiction. So talking about an info dump and avoiding it. And I've found a few definitions. The one I have always gone with as an info dump is simply story information that's delivered in an uninteresting way. And it's often too much and too soon. And to me, the biggest problem with supplying a lot of information at the very beginning of a story is it keeps the story from getting started, or it stops it after you've started it. And that's the early part of a story is really a bad place to stop. It's my contention that the reader doesn't really need to see the whole playing field before the story starts. They just need a little spot to stand on. The writer needs to ground the reader. And the characters will reveal themselves through the things that they do and say, and the story will reveal itself the same way. I'm just going to keep going for a moment on this. I think the worst kind of info dump is given through dialogue, and it's usually very easy to spot. It usually starts with a sentence like one character will say to another, "Hey, remember that time we," and then fill in. And it's to me that's the kiss of death. And I've seen it in movies and read it in books, and it never ends well. So what I want to do is I want to show the first paragraphs of a few books that I really enjoyed and talk about how they rope in the reader without lots and lots of information. And the first one is from Red Harvest by Dashiell Hammett. I'll read this one, and I'll get people to read the next. I first heard Personville called Poisonville by a red-haired mucker named Hickey Dewey in The Big Ship in Butte. He also called his shirt a shoit. I didn't think anything of what he had done to the city's name. Later, I heard men who could manage their R's give it the same pronunciation. I still didn't see anything in it but the meaningless sort of humor that used to make Richardsonary the thieves' word for dictionary. A few years later, I went to Personville and learned better. And I just say a few things about this. We're not getting much hard information about this story yet. It's in first person, so we're hearing it directly. Yes, I see somebody's got the cover. We're getting it in first person, so we're hearing directly from the character. And he's not giving us a lot of hard information. We know he's going to Personville. That's about the only solid thing we know. He implies that this is taking place out west, as he mentions Butte. He's also implying the mining industry because Hickey Dewey, the red-haired mucker, a mucker was a laborer in the mines. So we're getting a little bit, not a lot of hard information. But what we are getting is this marvelous style. He's giving us a lot of color and a lot of style. And he's giving us himself, sort of the character. Um, he's clever and he's amusing. He's a little bit snarky. This is the guy that you kind of want to be sitting next to in a boring work meeting because you'll be hearing a lot of good things from him. I'll wrap up what I'm going to say about this by just saying I think the critical sentence in this paragraph is the last one. A few years later, I went to Personville and learned better. Everything before that is this kind of jokey, amusing sort of language. And Mr. Hammett does something very important with this last sentence. And he's giving the reader a promise that I'm not just going to waste your time with a lot of jokes and foolishness for 200 pages. There really is a story here. And the sentence is written in, it's a very different style than the rest of the paragraph. It's a very sober sentence, serious. But what are other people getting from this? First, has anybody read this book? Okay, Charlie has. Anybody else? All right. Well, Charlie, what do you get out of this paragraph?
Yeah. This is,
Well,
I always felt like this paragraph just changing the name from Personville to Poisonville. It's a precursor, it's a foreshadowing of bad events that are going to happen in this place. Nothing but bad events happen in Poisonville. Now, if you were in Personville, maybe it wouldn't be so bad, but in Poisonville, you know you're going to be in trouble.
I think that's a really good point. And something I was thinking about today, I looked at this and I've read this book more than once. It's a real favorite of mine. And I think the word Poisonville is only mentioned twice in the entirety of the book, but you never forget it because of this paragraph. You never forget where you are, the name of the town, both names of the town. Um, I think the other time it gets mentioned, one of the characters, a woman named Diana Brand, says, "I'm a girl who knows her Poisonville," and I can't think of one other time it's written out. So this paragraph is doing that. It's cementing the name of the town in your memory, both names. It's doing a lot of work. This paragraph. Bill, did you have any thoughts about this? I think we got an audio problem with Bill. I can see you, Bill, but I can't hear you.
Yeah, forgot about that. I think it's an effective way to do it. It's certainly not the way I don't think I'm capable of doing it this way, but I feel like I spend half my time info dumping when I write and feeling guilty about it. But it's one of the reasons I'm here. But yeah, I think this. I would like to practice it, but I think it certainly works. You certainly learn a lot about the characters that he's talking about and something about the town. But like I said, I'd like to be able to practice it.
Yeah. I, I mean, this subject about info dumps and getting started with the story is very near and dear to my heart because I definitely understand the impulse, the feeling that, well, the reader's got to know this stuff before I can start saying this stuff. The first novel I ever wrote, it's fortunately went unpublished, but I realized well after the fact that the biggest problem with it was the story really didn't start till about the 50th page. And I had a lot of scenes and you know, things that were basically expository about who this guy was. And I felt like the reader needed to know all this before the story started. And I realized way after the fact, I didn't need to know any of that. I should have just started with the story. They'd have figured it out. Um, is anybody else getting anything out of this paragraph that I haven't mentioned or I haven't seen? I mean, what I miss is, what I don't know would fill a book. Anyone?
Interesting that he mentions the redheaded mucker first and sort of dismisses his assumption about how he's pronouncing the Personville versus Poisonville. Then he goes on to explain that he later discussed or he later heard men who can pronounce the R call it the same thing. So that sets up even more this idea of what Poisonville or what this place is actually like, because it's not about the pronunciation, it's actually about the place. So I
Right.
thought that.
No, go ahead, please.
I think that's it.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've always been taken with about this book, and especially about this paragraph, are the choices that Hammett made. There are a lot of ways to convey all this information. And he did it in this like loose, kind of jokey, almost snarky way. And it it dragged me in. I mean, it roped me in. I kept reading. I mean, I like to think that when somebody picks up a book and they open it, they're on the author's side. They want this to be good. They're looking for it to be good. And I think it's the author's job just to sort of let them know, like, yeah, you made a good choice picking this up. And I think this paragraph does that. I think it makes us curious, and the last sentence makes this promise to the reader. This isn't just going to be a lot of foolishness. There's a story here, and I kept reading. I'm going to go on to the next one because it's very different, and I like this almost as much. This was out by Natsuo Carino, and it was translated from the Japanese by Stephen Snyder. And can we get somebody else to read this, just so that I'm not the only one that's blathering on? Any volunteers? Everyone's being shy.
Yeah, I can read it.
I'll do it. I'm a terrible reader, but I'll give it
Go
a
ahead,
shot.
Bill.
She got to the parking lot earlier than usual. The thick, damp July darkness engulfed her as she stepped out of the car. Perhaps it was the heat and humidity, but the night seemed especially black and heavy. Feeling a bit short of breath, Masako Katori looked up at the starless night sky. Her skin, which had been cool and dry in the air-conditioned car, began to feel sticky, mixed in with the exhaust fumes from the Shin-Ume expressway. She could smell the faint odor of deep-fried food, the odor of boxed lunch factory where she was going to work. I want to go home. The moment the smell hit her, the words came into her head. She didn't know exactly what home it was she wanted to go to, certainly not the one she just left. But why didn't she want to go back there? And why did she want to, and where did she want to go? She felt lost.
Yeah, I like this a lot, and I love this book. And there's a couple of things that are curious, and I really wondered if it was the author or the translator. The first two references to this character are she and her, and it's not until later that we get her name, Misako Katori. And I wondered if this was for the benefit of non-Japanese readers. Because I don't know Japanese, and Misako, I don't know the gender of that name. And they establish it with the pronouns. Um, this I could be way off, but I'll bet that has something to do with it. And I'll bet it was the translator's choice. Um, Beyond all that, looking at the first paragraph, there's a lot of interesting things going on. Um, I love all these double words, mostly modifiers. The thick, damp July darkness, the heat and humidity, a couple of nouns. But the night seemed especially black and heavy, more double modifiers. Um, Her skin, which had been cool and dry in the air-conditioned car, began to feel sticky. And normally, I don't like double modifiers that much because I think it gives the writing a sing-songy uh, kind of feel. But here, considering that she's going into a factory, that double hit, it kind of feels like somebody working the ka-chunk machine, the two, uh, the what's the word? The two accents of these double words. And the first paragraph evokes this really strong feeling of an unpleasantness. There's not much nice going on here. It's not a place that anybody wants to be, especially the character. And in the second paragraph, she wants to go home, but she realizes she doesn't want to go to her home or the home she came from. She doesn't know where she wants to be, just doesn't want to be here or where she came from, and she feels lost. And I'll say two more things, and then I'll stop talking about it. She's locked into this because no matter how crappy her job is, she can afford a car with air conditioning that works on a hot night. So she's kind of doing okay that way, but she still feels trapped. The other thing I wanted to point out, which is the most curious part of these paragraphs, is the very first sentence. She got to the parking lot earlier than usual. And I'm wondering why she's showing up earlier to a job she clearly despises. Has anybody else read this? I recommend it. I recommend all these books, but I recommend this a lot. I really enjoy it. And I've read something else by her and I forget the title. I'm terrible with titles, but she's a really neat writer. But does anybody else have their 2 cents about something that they see in these paragraphs that I don't or haven't brought up? Charlie.
I thought the rule of thumb was you stayed away from weather. And when we started talking about thick, damp July and heat and humidity, it kind of lost me.
Really?
I don't know that it adds much to what she's been going through and what she's going to be going through. I don't know that the weather would have that much impact on it. So those sentences, those words, I was kind of losing focus. And that's my rule of thumb. You stay away from the weather as much as possible. Now, the second paragraph was much more interesting, I thought, than the first paragraph. So you know, she didn't want to go back there. Why didn't she want to go back there? And where did she want to go? Yeah, where does she want to? Where can she go? Like that, you know, and she
Yeah.
felt lost. And right there, you say, this is a girl that if she's not in trouble yet, she will be soon.
Yeah, yeah, it does give that sense. Um, I typically I agree with you about starting a story with weather, and that's one of Elmore Leonard's 10 rules of writing. Don't start with weather. Um, I think here it's significant just to give an idea of the oppressiveness that the character feels. But I do know what you mean. She might go, Carino might go on a little bit long with that, but I don't care. I still like it myself.
I'll say this, if we're trying to avoid info dump, I don't know that there's any information really dumped here about her backstory. I mean,
no.
if an info dump is backstory, I don't know really anything about this girl. In the previous example, he was talking to somebody in the past. So that was more dumpy than this piece here.
Sure. Yeah,
So,
that's a good point. We're not getting any backstory about this woman. All we know about her is she owns a car with air conditioning and she works a job she hates, and she doesn't feel good and she doesn't feel like going home either.
Exactly. That's not dumpy. That's just
No.
well, I have a
bad.
question though.
Yeah, and that's why I mean,
If you like the second paragraph better than the first,
Mhm.
what if this started with the first paragraph and then put the second paragraph?
Still too much weather.
I mean, we're assuming it seems to me that you're assuming that the weather is insignificant to the story without knowing anything else about the story. And to make a hard and fast rule that you don't talk about weather it seems silly to me. And what Elmore Leonard said was essentially, don't start with it's a dark and stormy night. He didn't mention as I recall, it's not a blanket rule about weather. I mean, if your goal is to describe a scene, then weather is certainly part of it. I don't really understand the objection to it.
yeah,
And I'm
I mean,
partly
I
saying
always,
that because my only successful story starts with the weather.
yeah, I mean, I like Elmore Leonard, and I take all those rules that he listed with a grain. I like them, and I see his point in all of them. I think here the weather's significant enough to be part of that first paragraph. Again, for the oppressiveness of the scene.
It sets a mood for sure.
Yeah.
Okay. And it's really not a dump per
Oh
se.
no. All of these that I'm showing are examples of non-info dumps
Right.
and how to convey information in an interesting way
Mhm.
and how to rope the reader in without giving them the entire playing field before the story starts. Both of these, every example I'm going to give you starts with the story from the first word. And
Yeah.
they're all very different, but they all start with story. And I'm gonna jump over to the next one. 'Cause
Tony,
the next one,
Tony, could I just add that
sure. I'm sorry.
it seems the weather mimics her ambivalence.
Um, yeah, I think I can see that. I mean, to me, I get again, I'll overuse the word. I get this feeling of oppression from this weather. Um, she feels short of breath. It's so humid and sticky. Um,
It
yeah,
seemed, the night seemed,
yeah,
perhaps, see, I just get the setup for her ambivalence.
yeah, yeah. That's true. That's a good point. I like that. I like that. Um, Good. Anybody else before I go to the next one? I'm going to go to the next one. These are the first two paragraphs from the Friends of Eddie Coyle by George V. Higgins. Great. I see somebody else has read it. How many people have read this book? Is it at least two? That's good.
Your recommendation.
Everybody should read this book. It might be my favorite book. And I know that's kind of a bold statement to be making. Does anybody want to read this?
I can read it.
Okay, go ahead.
Jackie Brown, at 26, with no expression on his face, said he could get some guns. I can get your pieces probably by tomorrow night. I can get you probably 6 pieces tomorrow night. In a week or so, maybe 10 days, another dozen. I got a guy coming in with at least 10 of them, but I already talked to another guy about 4 of them, and he's, expecting them. He's got something to do. So 6 tomorrow night, another dozen in a week. The stocky man sat across from Jackie Brown and allowed his coffee to grow cold. I don't know as I like that, he said. I don't know as I like buying stuff from the same lot as somebody else. Like, I don't know what he's going to do with it, If it was to cause trouble to my people on account of somebody else having some from the same lot, well, it could cause trouble for me too.
Thank you, Daniel. I could probably talk about these 2 paragraphs for the entire hour, and I don't want to do that. Everybody who reads this book or reads anything by Mr. Higgins, everybody raves about the dialogue, and it's worth raving about. I think it's great dialogue, but I was looking at this in preparation, and I want to talk about the 2 narrative sentences in these paragraphs. Both paragraphs start with narrative sentences. And the first one is really weird. Jackie Brown, at 26, with no expression on his face, said that he could get some guns. And it's perfectly grammatical and everything that, but look at the verbs. Jackie Brown at 26. And this book is definitely, Higgins was a minimalist, and this book is spare. And you don't even need that word at, but he put it in there. He could have just said Jackie Brown, 26, with no expression, but he put at 26. And it's a verb, it's an action. He's gotten to 26. He's reached 26, as though this might be an accomplishment. And then the next phrase, with no expression on his face, and the verb is with. And he possesses this. He has this. He has no expression on his face. And to me, this implies he's working at having no expression on his face. It's the second phrase in the story, and I think it's significant for that reason. I don't think this was just dashed off. I think Mr. Higgins was calculating. He said that he could get some guns. And the next paragraph starts with, the stocky man sat across from Jackie Brown and allowed his coffee to grow cold. Very innocuous in a way. But again, look at the verbs. The stocky man sat across from Jackie Brown. And Jackie Brown at this point is clearly sitting, but he didn't mention that Jackie Brown was seated. The stocky man sat across from Jackie Brown and allowed his coffee to grow cold. And there's a lot of verbs he could have used there or just left that part out entirely. But he allowed his coffee to grow cold. And I think whether a reader is as analytical as I'm being right now, or if they just read it, I think psychologically it works to show that there's definitely a pecking order here. There's a power structure. Part of it we get because we get Jackie Brown's name and we get that he's 26. He's a young guy. And I think it's safe to assume that the stocky man is older than he is. But the other thing, I lied. I'm going to say one more thing about this before I let it out. Look at the sheer number of repetitions in both of these paragraphs. The stocky man says, I don't know as I like that. I don't know as I like buying stuff from the same lot. And then he says, like, I don't know. And we're aware painfully that the stocky man is displeased with Jackie Brown, you know, and his way of doing business. Does anybody have an idea as to what the stocky man is really objecting to, what he really doesn't like? Because it's right there. Anyone?
Well, I mean, he doesn't want to buy a gun that's that's in a lot with other guns that might be used in crimes that could be
Right.
traced back to him.
Right. That's right there. But what does he really object to here? I'll give it to you because it's a lot, you know, and it's unfair because I've read this book many times, and this is the first time for just about everybody. Jackie Brown brings up this other guy that he's selling 4 of these guns to. He doesn't need to. He doesn't need to bring up any of this stuff. And I think that's what the stocky man is really objecting to. Jackie Brown has a big mouth. He's a kid with a big mouth, and he didn't need to say anything about this other guy, but he told the stocky man his business. And the stocky man has to wonder, well, who else is he going to tell my business to? And I think that's what the real objection is here. And I might be reading an awful lot into these 2 short paragraphs, but I don't think so. I think this was calculated. And this does come up later a couple of times in the story. So I base part of my judgment, you know, part of my opinion on that too. Does anybody else have any thoughts about that? Or am I making myself clear?
I mean, what I took out of it, a lot of what I took out of it is that he's very skillful at describing these two guys without really describing them. Just the fact that Jackie Brown's 26 and has no expression on his face. I get the feeling of somebody, and the way he put this, I get the feeling that he's trying a little too hard to make a deal. What I'm impressed by also is how saying that the stocky man allowed his coffee to grow cold not only establishes a kind of a pecking order, like you mentioned, but also it's a way of establishing a passage of time. Allowing his coffee to go cold means he actually sat there for a while, because your coffee doesn't grow cold, you know, in 10 seconds.
I never thought of that.
The typical pause.
And like I say, I've read this many times, and I think you're absolutely right. I think the stocky man was sitting there, probably waiting. And he's clearly not interested in drinking his coffee. His coffee, he's paying for a seat in a diner by buying a cup of coffee. That's a good point, and I didn't think about that. One other thing that's about these first 2 paragraphs, unlike the 2 stories before it, those 2 stories before it could have been any kind of story, where this is clearly crime fiction. We're talking about buying and selling guns. The other 2 could still be stories about anything. The guy goes to Personville. He could be a truck driver. He could be a salesman. He could be a lot of things. And we haven't spelled that out yet. This one does. From the first sentence, we know what kind of story this is going to be. Anybody else?
Well, the other thing is that these 2 paragraphs fit into our topic tonight, not dumping information on the reader at the outset of the story. Rather, building it up so you're thinking about the future and not the past.
Right, right. I mean, I mean, from the first word, we're into the story here. And to me, that was the hook there. And I love the dialogue. It's especially the stocky man's, because it's kind of colloquial, almost in an archaic way. I don't know as I like that. I don't recall hearing anybody say that, but I know exactly what he meant. Um, uh, I mean, this story definitely does take place in a very specific location, and the language and the accents and speech patterns harken to that location. It takes place in Boston, and it harkens to 1970s Boston. Um, Anything else? I'll, I'll move on then.
Yeah.
I'll read this one just because I like it so much. This is probably my favorite first paragraph of this bunch. From God's Pocket by Pete Dexter. Leon Hubbard died 10 minutes into lunch break on the first Monday in May on the construction site of the new one-story trauma wing at Holy Redeemer Hospital in South Philadelphia. One way or the other, he was going to lose the job. And I love this. This is not my favorite novel of this bunch, but it's definitely my favorite first paragraph. Has anybody read this or anything else by Pete Dexter? Yeah. Pete was a newspaper man. He worked. He wrote a column in the Philadelphia Daily News for years and years before he ever wrote or published his first novel. And he's not a native Philadelphian. I believe Pete's from Kansas or Nebraska, and has that delight that only somebody from somewhere else can have in a place. It's clear reading anything that he ever wrote that he loves Philadelphia. And I love this paragraph because the first sentence is almost newspaper copy. It's just the facts. It gives us who, Leon Hubbard, what, died, when, 10 minutes into lunch break, where, the one-story trauma wing at Holy Redeemer Hospital in South Philadelphia. It's almost news. And then he takes this left turn. One way or the other, he was going to lose the job. You'd never see that in the newspapers. And much like Dashiell Hammett does with his last sentence, Pete Dexter's sort of doing the same thing, but in reverse. He's giving you all this hard information, and then one way or the other, he's going to lose the job. He's giving us this promise, this assurance, like, no, this isn't just going to be a collection of facts. There's going to be a fun story here too. And that's Pete, Mr. Dexter. I mean, he's got that kind of sense of humor. But I'm rambling on. Does anybody else get anything from this?
I just think that last line really sets the tone for the whole.
Yeah.
Actually, you know, his stuff is full of really dry humor, as I recall.
Yeah.
I read this probably 30 years ago or something, 20 at least. And I think I read all of his books. The one I like the least is the one that he won the award for, the Paris Trout.
That's interesting that you say that, because I've started reading that no less than 4 times and can't get past the first chapter.
Yeah, it's pretty grim.
Yeah, it's just, this poor little girl, and I just I just can't keep reading.
It's also the only one I think that doesn't take place in Philly.
He wrote a book called The Paperboy, and that takes place in Florida.
Oh yeah, you're right. Yeah, I forgot about
Yeah.
that one.
But I think there's a Philadelphia connection in that book too. Maybe I might be wrong, but yeah, he does like to write about Philadelphia. Probably my favorite book of his is Brotherly Love, which is incredibly dark. If you don't like dark, don't read it. But it's, to me, I think it's the best depiction of alienation I've ever read. Anyway, I don't think it did well for Mr. Dexter. I heard him interviewed on the radio, and he was talking
That's the
about
one
that.
where the kid gets run over on his front lawn.
Yes, yes.
Towards the line, right? Yeah.
Pete Dexter said about this in an interview. Random House gave him like some kind of outrageous advance for the paperback rights, something like $50,000. And he says, I think they're still looking to collect another 49,000 from that advance. But it's still a great book. It just wasn't popular. Anybody else? I'll move on. This one I like a lot. Has anybody read this book? It's been around for a long time. Spy Who Came In From the Cold by John le Carré. A few people. Does anybody want to read it? I'll read it if we don't get a volunteer.
I mean, I'll do it, but I already read one.
All right, I'll read it. I'll read it just because I like it. The American handed Lemus another cup of coffee and said, "Why don't you go back and sleep? We can ring you if he shows up." Lemus said nothing, just stared through the window of the checkpoint along the empty street. "You can't wait forever, sir. Maybe he'll come along some other time. We'll have to pull his eye, contact the agency. You can be back here in 20 minutes. "No," said Lemus. "It's nearly dark now." "But you can't wait forever. He's 9 hours over schedule." "If you want to go, go. You've been very good," Lemus added. "I'll tell Kramer you've been damn good." "But how long will you wait?" "Until he comes." For the benefit of any of the attendees who are younger than me, reading along, before 1989, the word checkpoint pretty much only meant one place in the world. It was Checkpoint Charlie, was the passage between East and West Berlin in the American zone. So that's what that is. There's not a ton of hard information here other than they're at the checkpoint and they're inside. And it's they've been there for 9 hours. Other than that, we don't know anything about these characters. Lemus clearly is the man in charge. And the way this hooked me in when I read it, and the first time I read it was recently, and this exchange really hooked me. I could identify with both of these characters because Lemus is the boss, but he's not really needed there. You can tell from what the American says. He keeps trying to get him to leave because the American knows he can handle this, whatever this is. And he doesn't need Lemus looking over his shoulder. But Lemus is not going because Lemus ultimately is responsible. And he can't leave. He can't let this go. He's got to watch this. And what's implied and what we will learn, I'm not giving much away, what's implied in this is an agent of theirs is going to try to come back through the checkpoint. And Lemus can't leave because Lemus is the man who put him there. And the responsibility is wrapped up in guilt and fear and everything else. And he's not going. And the American wants him to go because he's just sort of looking over everybody's shoulder and making everybody anxious as he is. It's interesting that I find it interesting, like really of this entire exchange, nothing matters but the last two sentences. how long will you wait until he comes? And he kind of puts closes the door on the rest of this conversation with that line. But there's a lot here. There's a lot to unpack. Does anybody who has or has not read this seeing anything in this that I'm not bringing up?
When you think about this section here by itself, you understand that Lemus is heavily invested in this, and that he's just not going to walk away.
Right.
And that leads to questions like, well, why is he so invested? And there are the kinds of questions that you want answered going forward.
Yeah, and they do get answered very quickly.
Mhm.
Have you read this one, Charlie?
Yeah, I have. And I
Yeah.
got it out in the living room. Yeah.
Yeah.
I've read a lot of his.
I've read some of his, and he's definitely not my favorite British spy novelist, but he's good, and this is a really good book.
Very intelligent, Tony, and maybe that's what turns you off. I find that the level of intelligence in his books are as much higher than any of the other ones that I've read that we've talked about today. You have to read every word, and you have to understand what he's telling you. But to go back to our topic tonight, there's no backstory here. I mean,
No.
you don't know who the American is. You don't know who Lemus is, and who are they waiting for? We don't know that either. But
Right.
so there's nothing here. There's not even weather here, which is a good thing. So I just
yeah, it's nearly dark.
Draws you in, and that's what these opening lines are supposed to do. They draw you into the book.
Right. Again, when this was written and before 1989, the word checkpoint gave you a tiny bit of backstory because we understood it was
information, but it's
checkpoint
not a
Charlie.
dump. It's not a dump. You
No.
can
Oh,
surmise.
no. Absolutely
It
not.
could have been in Czechoslovakia. We don't know.
Right.
But he just uses that loaded word checkpoint, and checkpoint Charlie comes to mind.
Right. Anybody else? All right, I'm gonna move along then. I'm gonna skip Gary, just because I want to get to mine, and I'm not including my story because I believe it belongs with all these others. I'm including mine only because I can say definitively what my intentions were when I wrote these. And I apologize to Gary Phillips for skipping him. I had the great pleasure of meeting Mr. Phillips last month. I was in California at a convention, and I'm a big fan. Gary Phillips he was in the writer's room of the show Snowfall, if anybody watched that. Anyway, I'll read my words here. Buddy got in touch on a Tuesday in late September and said he had something. It's got to be this Friday, he said, if you're interested. Buddy dealt cards in Atlantic City. He also had a good eye and would talk to guys like me if something looked promising. This is the kind of thing you like. We worked it out, and the next day I took Susan to Margate. I thought it was too chilly, but she lay out on the beach while I drove to Buddy's house in Ventnor. He took more than 10 minutes to come outside. When he did, he pulled free a pair of Ray-Bans from his black leather coat and squinted at my Honda. Where'd you get that piece of shit? He slipped on the sunglasses and pointed to a black Dodge Charger across the street. Let's take mine. Which way am I going, buddy? Before I get into information or not, I want to bring up one thing. It's sort of not part of this subject, but in Hollywood, one of the expressions they have there is casting is everything. And when I started writing this, Buddy was an older guy. He was still a card dealer from Atlantic City, but he was an older guy. And I worked on it for a little while and I couldn't get Buddy to say much. And when he did, it wasn't very interesting and it wasn't working. And I realized if I make these guys closer in age, there'll be some conflict there. And the first thing, it was one of those times, and most writers know about this, but sometimes you come up with a line of dialogue that it feels like the character said it without you. And the where'd you get that piece of shit line was that. Like as soon as he came out of his house. And I kept going with him. I couldn't shut this guy up now. And it was great. And it was just by making him younger. He developed a personality. But back on the subject of information or not, I gave a fair amount of hard information here. Buddy got in touch on a Tuesday in late September and said he had something, and it's got to be this Friday. And he's talking about the shore. So we know a lot already. And in the next paragraph, it's in first person, so we're hearing directly from the character. We worked it out, and I took Susan. The next day, I took Susan to Margate. And I think, like, when I first finished this, I was really pleased with that line, "Where'd you get that piece of shit?" But I later came to realize I think the most important line in this story, at least in the first part of the story, is we worked it out, and the next day I took Susan to Margate. Because in one sentence, I went across, I skipped 24 hours, and I went from Philadelphia to Margate, New Jersey. I traveled 65 miles and 24 hours in one sentence. And I made this promise to the reader: I'm not going to waste your time with perfunctory information for things that don't matter. I'm going to get right to the story. Another goofy thing I did here, I also tend to be sort of a minimalist, and I love to eliminate words that I don't need. But I put one in where it wasn't really needed. I thought it was too chilly, but she lay out on the beach while I drove to Buddy's. And I didn't need that word out. But every time I wrote she lay on the beach, I saw her fully clothed. I saw her wearing a hoodie because it was chilly. But when I wrote she lay out on the beach, now I see a woman in a bathing suit. And I don't know why, if that works for anybody else, but it worked for me. So it had to be there. Just a choice. But again, I think this sentence, we worked it out. The next day I took Susan to Margate, was the critical one there. I think that was, like I say, that was that promise I made the reader. I'm not going to waste your time. This is all going to be good stuff, or try to be good stuff.
Well, Tony, even in that very first line, you left out some words that normally would have been in there, but in your spareness of writing, you decided not to even put them in. In other words, most people would have written this. Buddy got in touch with me.
Right.
You know what I mean? So
yeah.
we didn't even have those two simple words in there. And so just from a writerly point of view, it's like, so this guy is really sparse, again, sparse with his words.
Yeah, I try to be. A lot of times I know writers who talk about their word count every day. Oh, I did 700 words. I did 1,000 words. And I always have to tell them, sometimes my most productive days, my word count actually goes down because I've eliminated things. I like to, I'm very much a Strunk and White kind of guy. Eliminate unnecessary words. Cut. It's just how I like to write. I don't have to only read that sort of thing, but it's how I like to write. Does anybody else have any questions about this or anything else I've spoken about?
I'll make one last comment to those people who have not read Tony's stuff, and this one especially. You don't know where these guys are coming from. You don't know. You hope you're just along for the ride, and because you don't know, did this guy go to Roman Catholic high school? No, we don't care. He does not give you any of that back stuff. If you want to read a story that has like minimal backstory, read a Tony Knighton story.
Well, thank you. I'll take that as a compliment.
Yeah.
Yeah, I try to write that way.
Mhm.
But like I say, it took me a while, and everybody has to learn how to write seriously, but it took me a while, but I figured out early on that if I wrote very simply and carefully, I could turn out stuff that approximated good prose. And that if I got right into it, like I said, the first novel I tried, the story really didn't start till about the 50th page. And when I came to that realization that that's why that was the biggest problem with that story, I resolved never to do that again. I was going to get right into it.
Mhm.
And sometimes that means skipping over a lot of things and really grabbing the reader by the scruff of the neck and saying, like, no, you're coming with me. Don't worry about everything off to the side. It's not the only way to write, but it's the way I like to write. But anybody else, any questions about this or anything? Well, I'm going to leave it at that then. I'm sorry, Bill.
Kind of a quick one.
Yeah.
Sometime I'd like to talk about how you describe relatively complicated theoretical issues without information dumps. If I'm in the middle of it now of trying to do this, and if we want to have another session, I would like to talk about that, because I'm having a lot of trouble doing it without it sounding like an information dump.
Again, I can appreciate the impulse, like the feeling that I really need, like the reader's really going to need this. And I mean, it's tough because all these things are choices, and that's where things like workshops and B readers and all that are invaluable, because I know myself, I get so immersed in these stories that I kind of lose perspective. I know what the story is going to be. I know what the story is, but is what I'm thinking about the story coming across on the page? And you really need other readers to let you know about that. I do anyway. So workshops are good.
Gonna interrupt real quick because we're at
Sure.
time. I'll wrap up and then I'll say my.
Sure. I'll say one more thing about everything on every example here. Every one of them include trouble on the first page. And I think no matter what kind of fiction you write, that's a key component. I think it's important. I think if you'll think about books that you love, all of them started with some sort of trouble on the first page. I mean, even mine, there's not really trouble, but you can see that there's going to be conflict. Buddy's an asshole. He lets the guy wait 10 minutes and then insults his car. So trouble's a good way to rope in the reader, I think. And I think that's all I got for right now. Julian, you want to take it away?
Yeah, thank you so much, Tony. I learned a lot. It seems like other people did too, and I really appreciate everyone taking time out of their busy schedule to do a little midweek learning. I just posted some links in the chat. There's a feedback survey, so you can let Tony know how much you enjoyed the session, or if you have any ideas for the future sessions. An events page where you can see our final event of the year next week. It's a co-working session on Zoom, basically just a generative get-together for some mutual accountability if you have some writing to do. This is our last Thursdays on the Stoop for the season. So grateful for everyone who tuned in today and over the past 6 months since I came into this role. And we will return in early January for more sessions like this. So subscribe to our weekly newsletter. It's one of those links I just posted to stay up to date on all things Blue Stoop. And last but not least, if you want to support this and other work that we're doing for the community, check out bluestoop.org/donate. There's also a handy link there to an online auction that will be open through December 20th and includes all kinds of fabulous prizes that I will now briefly ramble at you about. We got query letter critiques, fiction, like editorial critiques. There is a canoeing, a kayaking excursion, a clowning class, tarot deck and tarot readings. I could keep going. Pottery lessons, fresh flowers, books, all kinds of fabulous stuff. So check that out. All of the funding goes to support our scholarship fund, all of the proceeds go to support our scholarship fund and free programs like this and our general capacity building as an organization. So I'll stop there. Thank you again and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.